Hi, everyone. Welcome to JavaScript Jam. I'm Ishan Nand, head of product at Layer.
And I'm Mark Mercado, VP of Engineering at Layer Zero.
And on today's episode, we have Ryan Carniato, who is the creator of a hot new framework called Solid.js, which is all about performance, but it keeps it very React-like if you're coming from that background. And in his day job, he works at eBay as a software engineer working on Marco. So, Ryan, welcome to JavaScript Jam.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Before we jump into Solid, just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
Yeah, I've been doing web dev for quite a long time. I got into programming websites when I was in my early teens in the 90s, just actually around the time the web was getting popular. And I learned, really basic JavaScript back then. But I when I got into the job market, I was doing like .NET. And when JavaScript kind of came back around with Ajax and jQuery and Knockout, that's really when I felt like I felt in stride again, and I just dove in and been there ever since, pretty much.
And have you always been basically building frameworks, or how does Solid say relate to? I think you were working on Marco at eBay. Maybe tell folks a little bit about what Marco is about.
Yeah. Yeah, I wasn't always building frameworks. My start, I got hired by a startup and back in 2012, and the I guess CEO of that startup was the creator of a library called Knockback, which was a combination between Knockout and Backbone. And up to then, I used some of the, I've used Knockout and I used a bit of Ember, but I hadn't really thought of contributing to open source myself. But being a startup, and we're always kind of building tools and stuff, just simply with what we had. And this is like 2012, pre-React or whatnot. He basically got me into doing open source because I had no choice, because that was the tooling we were using. And then in 2014, or 15, I can't remember exactly when, he moved on. And then I was left maintaining a lot of these libraries. And at some point I was like, I need to build something better. We were using, he was great that he left it really open for the team to contribute and do their ideas. And he helped me build a web component framework. Basically around our Knockout components, so we could get components and kind of more modernized thing. We were basically almost emulating something kind of like React using web components and Knockout.js. And at a certain point, I was like, I want to do a better version of this. This is not going to last forever. And we all really liked the patterns of Knockout.js, and React was different, so it didn't really fit with what we wanted to do. It's funny. In 2019, we rewrote the app in React. And I was in charge at that point and helped make that decision. Solid wasn't ready at that point to where I wanted it to be, but that's when I started in Solid back in 2015-16 time period. I wanted to make a true successor to Knockout, and I really believed in the paradigm there and the approach of reactivity. It's funny because you mentioned eBay and stuff. That all actually happened afterwards. They saw my work in Solid and they're like, "Come work for us," and I was like, this is awesome, because they've been tackling a completely different set of problems that are also getting attention now because of frameworks like Astro coming up. But basically, I'm kind of championing two frameworks on the opposite side of the spectrum. Solid is almost like React. It's like a single page app framework that has really all about state management and building applications, where Marco, and the reason I got so into it, was all about server-side rendering and websites, dynamic websites, JavaScript-powered websites, but it was a completely different spectrum. I hadn't even looked at server-side rendering with Solid that much at that time, and these guys had async streaming, rendering on the server, automatic partial hydration islands. I'm throwing a bunch of lingo out there right now that I might get into in a minute, but they basically have a lot of the features that you're going to expect out of frameworks in the next couple of years back in 2014. And that was because they had a different use case. Whereas Facebook and Twitters of the world were trying to build applications, Marco was trying to, at eBay, build the fastest loading websites for e-commerce. And in that regard, interesting enough, it has one of the most advanced compilers I'd come across in the whole ecosystem. They're kind of doing the Svelte thing before Svelte was doing it. And I was just like, wow, this is like a treasure. So even though I was working on my own framework and, doing that thing, I was like, the opportunity to work on this is amazing. I'm learning so much, and I'm sharing stuff. I'm helping with the client-side performance. They've been teaching me with about server rendering. It's been a really awesome experience.
Wow. 2014 is really early to be doing a lot of that stuff. That's really fascinating.
Yeah. It's because that was their starting point. They were like, we knew that we needed to get the fastest page scores. Like, we knew that we needed to ship the least amount of JavaScript. So everything in Marco was built to not send JavaScript to the browser, even though the whole framework's written in JavaScript. So, yeah, it's pretty different kind of thing. But
so maybe at the end we can come back to Astro versus Marco, but maybe we can save that for the end.
Yeah.
You've given me so much to dig into right there. We have an entire 2 podcasts of material that I'm just itching to dive into. So maybe let's start by relating Solid to something that, if I had to bet on people knowing one thing, it would be React in this audience. So what's the relationship between Solid and React? How would you compare the two?
Yeah, it's interesting because Solid came out of this place where I actually had a lot of, I wouldn't say dislike, but I was like frustrated that like my favorite libraries were dying. Like the approach of reactivity. React came in with a model that in some cases was, simpler, this kind of view as a function of state mentality. And within a year or two, you can look, all the other older reactive libraries that are kind of playing around just died almost, with a few exceptions. Vue kind of came out during that time and kind of got their niche, and Angular was going through their thing, but there's other things, reactive, CanJS. There's a few Knockout. There's a number of reactive libraries, and I just wanted to keep that mentality. The reason we get compared a lot to React, though, is because Solid learned a lot from React, is the best way to put it. I looked at what succeeded for React and what people didn't like about these reactive libraries, and was like, okay, what can I do about it? And what ended up happening was funny, because it started with, perhaps using JSX and the templating language, but ultimately we were still kind of very different at that point. And it was only when React released React hooks in 2018, or when they first announced it, that it became clear to me that we were at an almost, I wouldn't say colliding, but a very similar trajectory, because React hooks resemble those older reactive libraries a certain way, not in the way they execute, but in the way that their APIs are formed, the way that you have this idea of like state, derived value or memo, and side effects, like the 3 basic primitives. And all the reactive libraries had that. Then React had it all of a sudden, and I saw hooks and I was like, I couldn't believe it at first, because I was building a library to get away from React's classes and life cycles and basically keep those hook-like composition that I've enjoyed for years now. And I saw hooks and I was like, oh, wow, that's amazing. I can't believe it. And the big part for me is they solved this last problem I was having. I was trying to make the interface really clean in terms of read-write segregation. I wanted to make sure that directional flow was important. That was kind of what killed a lot of those early reactive libraries in my mind. And React was always really good at saying like data down, and events up kind of mentality in terms of their unidirectional flow. And hooks had this idea of returning a tuple, the arrays. I didn't think of it. I admit, I was trying to put like gets and sets on things and all this stuff. And I saw the hooks API and I was like, that's it. So I took what I already had with my reactive primitives and just had them return tuples instead, and add that with JSX, and everyone moving very quickly to hooks. You suddenly have a library that looks just like React.
Yeah, so let me back up a step and just level set for if I was to summarize. Solid is like a React-looking, shall we say, API. Now, under the hood, the engine is obviously different. But the chief benefit is Solid is very, very performant. I think in the performance benchmarks, and these are on your homepage, Solid blows everything out of the water except for vanilla.js. So it's better performance than React with a very similar API. Would that be, if I was to break it down into, the old 140 characters tweet, is that a fair summary?
That's how I started positioning things, and
Okay.
and that's what, because I started from trying to get that performance. The truth of the matter, though, is if you look at like my motivation for why I wanted to keep on using knockout and whatnot, and a lot of people tell you after the fact, they'll see the video where people are like, oh, it's performance, so what? The actual API, even though the syntax surface is the same, the execution model is different enough that a lot of people find it simpler. It's actually, they feel that it's actually easier to write solid. The code reduction that you see in something like Svelte or Vue, where people are like, oh, it's so much easier, you don't have to write as much code. Even though we have React's like syntax, you get that same kind of code reduction over React.
Got it. So it's faster performance, a simpler mental model in terms of execution, and then it looks superficially like React would be the 3-point summary.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think so.
So I'd love to dive into performance. There must be something at some level there in Solid that intrinsically gives it an advantage over React.
Yeah.
You know, why it has such better performance. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it comes down to we remove a bit of the abstraction layer and we use a technique called fine-grained reactivity, which is the idea that we kind of just, we do our input, a lot of our updates in piece by piece in slices. Instead of like kind of having this pattern where you like set state and go re-render the whole component, do this, diff the changes, Solid actually only renders its components once, and it's actually the bindings that update. This is actually an older idea from like the knockout era, but you know, when we're not dealing with a virtual DOM and we're not like re-rendering everything all the time, you just kind of intrinsically have this faster performance. This actually might, I don't know where we're on the time, but this actually might be a good thing to actually show you guys if you're really interested on the difference between React.
Yeah. Let's jump into the demo then. That might be a good seg.
Okay. Yeah, let me share my screen for a bit, because I'm sure you guys will have questions when I show it, but I think this is actually the piece that a lot of people say, because a lot of times when people do a demo, they might be like, oh, you know, here's my framework or my library, and this is how you use it, right? And the thing is, for Solid, because of the similarity of the API to React, simple examples aren't going to cut it. You're going to see it and be like, sorry, I'm going to switch here, and just be like, actually, no, I want to do this one, sorry. And just be like, this looks like React a little bit, and for good reason. Basically, here's a very simple counter like you see on every single demo you've probably ever seen, right? We're clicking a button, it counts up. And if you look at the code, it doesn't look dissimilar to React. Basically, we don't have useState, but we have this thing called signal, and signals are similar to states. They're basically reactive primitives that hold the value. And you know, we get our count and set count. The biggest difference here is that count is not just the value, it is a value getter. It's a function you call it. See how this is, I'm calling the count, and I'm also calling the count here. But essentially, this gives this very React-like model for you to see, but it behaves very differently. Because what I'll tell you right now, what actually happens is we render that button, and our compiler basically is smart enough to just go, oh, this one piece of text here subscribes to count. So when you press the button, just update that text. Don't update anything else. Like literally, if I go console.log hi, you know, in here, and go hi, right? I can click the button and hi will never print again. If I wanted it to print again, I could create effect, which if you use React is like use effect, and basically tell it. But the key difference here is the components. See, even this isn't going to actually update because there's nothing dynamic about this expression. But my point is only these hooks re-execute, not the whole component. So this is immediately a departure from React. Because instead of viewing your components as a pure function, that is something that like you just kind of run through and transform, we actually view reactivity as the purity layer, like the hooks, and everything else is a side effect. That's a bit more on the academic side of things, but essentially this has quite large repercussions in terms of execution models. So immediately, if you are hoping that you just plug in your React components, well, a simple example like this is going to work similar to React. More complicated ones don't, and I actually have another example to show you. But first, I'm going to throw it out there if you guys have any questions about what you've seen so far.
Yeah, I just want to underscore. Yeah. So I want to underscore one thing for the audience. Like, basically, unlike React, where like that counter function would run every time there was a change, you run that only once. It's almost effectively on mount, kind of. And then because you're using a function call to access the value of count rather than just a straight variable, you're able to detect when that happens and make sure that only those things get rendered when you know that thing changed.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, and I can actually illustrate this a little bit further. I'm just going to go click here, and I'm gonna do something that might not be visible, but is easier to see on the compiled output. Because
yeah, and to reemphasize this, I guess like line 7, you'd be creating a new function every time. In regular React, here there's only one function this whole execution from 5 to 15 only really happens once.
Yeah. And
then little piecemeal parts update. So, sorry, Mark, go ahead. What were you going to ask?
No, I think Ryan should continue with what he's showing here, and then I'll ask any questions.
Because what I wanted to show you guys is that actually, you know what? I'm gonna cheat a bit. You could pretend this is like dangerously set inner HTML. It's just easier for me. Sorry, not content. It's easier for me to kind of show this on an attribute than it is on an insert, because insert's a little bit more complicated. But okay, we're just setting the text content here, and this is more or less what the insert does. When we compile our output here, just for a second, I know this is getting a little technical here. What you'll see is we have some templates that we clone, which are actually just string templates of the div and the button or whatnot. Mm-hmm. But your code up here, the counter and the effect, don't actually get changed. The code you write stays the same, but the renderer, the JSX, is completely different. And basically, it involves cloning a template and then walking that template and just creating an effect essentially around setting that data. That's what I was trying to show. Essentially, we just compile the JSX into more of the same, more of this like create effect stuff. If that makes sense. So this is getting a little bit more on the technical side.
It does, but I'm going to poke at it. It's just what my brain is doing. My brain's on fire trying to break this thing, trying to figure out where does this limit me in terms of functionality. Like with React, I think one of the things that developers have always loved about React is in the end it's just JavaScript. The JSX transform is a pretty simple one. And you can write, simple if-else logic, for example, in any component, and it behaves like you think it would. So, where are there limits with this model? Like, could I do, if some condition, then return one type of component, otherwise return a different type of component?
Right. Yeah.
How dynamic can I make things?
You can, but there's limits to where you can do it. If you just, in your component top level, do an if statement, because the component only executes once, it can't reevaluate that if statement. But if you put a ternary operator in your JSX, like if count is bigger than 5, show, I don't know, what do I want to show? High, that it's high, or it's high, and then otherwise show count. If we're talking expressions, and this includes like DOM expressions too, like it includes other elements and whatnot. This could be a component that we're rendering instead of count. You can basically do all of those kind of things within the JSX and within the hooks. It's just top level like if statement type stuff that doesn't work. Because
how would you implement something like a router where, like, based on the URL, it's a big if-else block where you're going through different possible.
There's a couple different approaches. One of the ones, and I can just pull this off, are tutorials, which are very similar to. We were very inspired by Svelte here. one thing that we did was we built in some helpful control flows. Everything happens at runtime. This is not compile based, but Solid ships with a few helpers, and one good one for routing is obviously we have a show, but I'm just going to slip here. We also have things like switch and match, where you basically can have components that do stuff like switch and then match when X is bigger than 10, when 5. You can basically use component control flows, and our router actually looks a lot like React Router 6. If you want like reference in terms of the way it works, it has the routes and the outlets and the JSX routing. This stuff is more or less very, very similar on that aspect.
Gotcha. Okay.
So here's the thing: when you write, some people like see the JSX control flows that ship with the library, and they're a little bit like, right? You know, I just want to use map, and as it's simple stuff like ternararies and a Boolean logic, because it's JavaScript expressions, I can analyze them and optimize them. But like a map function is just a function. I don't know that.
Yeah.
I ship with these helper functions, and there's a function version. But the reason I push people towards a control flow is the second you get past that simple example, once your list becomes a paginated list or a virtualized list, or once you are doing a layout component around that if statement, you naturally wrap things in components. And the key thing, this kind of composability pattern that you find in hooks, you know, you can make use state into use local state, you know, is the same reason why we all love components. You can just abstract on top of it to build these better patterns, and you know, and that's the same basis here. We just build everything, you know, on that. Like if there's a for loop, let's say for loop, and let me put the for loop in here. If I wanted to change this for to like my own component, I just, you know what I mean? Like it still works the same way. I can just replace it. This is the difference between a lot of like Vue or Svelte like templating languages where you have like a special syntax for control flows. These are all just normal components. Even our control flows are not compiled. The compiler is only really responsible for optimizing DOM operations.
So there must be a primitive that the for component there is using that's kind of different in some way, right? Because the compiler is optimizing for it at some level. Yeah,
because the problem with a map function, and I can get back to one of these examples, is one of the things that I haven't really highlighted here, but maybe I'll just show you guys really quickly here is, and this kind of helps I think a bit, is if I just went like const div equals div, let's just make something. It's not going to have anything special, and I mean I could even put the count in here. It doesn't really matter. It's going to be empty, right? And then I went, let's go return div, and then I went console.log div. Like, can you guys guess what this div is? And
no.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I guess it's just a string.
It's an actual HTML div element. And that's why map is no good. Because if you just mapped over it, you would, every time you update the list, you'd map your data to a new div. So we have helpers built in that go, okay, only if the data is changed, do the mapping. And that's what's underneath the for loop. The other stuff, though, like conditions and shows, like conditionals and stuff, are mostly just built off like stuff like our create memo, which is a version of use memo, and like basically analogs of that. It just, some of the more complicated control flows have complicated logic, which is why we ship that. Obviously, you could use map. If your list never reordered, then you could use map and you'd be fine. It's just you don't want to be recreating it every time the data changes. So that's it on that side. But there are benefits or trade-offs here on the positive side. And can I show you guys quickly what I was thinking?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Because the performance thing is interesting, and then obviously there's these kind of trade-offs where you're like, okay, now I'm dealing with real DOM nodes. I can't just create stuff as loosely. I need to use some helper functions, maybe some control flows. But on the other side, you kind of get this scenario where this is kind of popular example, and I have to comment this out because things go pretty bad pretty quickly here. But let's look at the old self-incrementing counter in React. Hopefully anyone who's seen React knows that something really terrible is about to happen here, because essentially every time the component re-renders, let me comment this out quickly before I crash my browser. It's still going. Every time the component re-renders, it creates a new interval, and that would be chaos. But your first attempt at doing something like this might have looked like that. The answer, obviously, is to use create effect. And as again, it's because React, you have a pure render function, and you want to be able to kind of isolate. So not create effect, it's use effect.
Oh, you want use effect?
Yeah. This is what we were talking about on the equivalent line. You're creating that new function every time. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason I'm mentioning use, I use create instead of use in Solid because I thought that it would be great if to differentiate that. So instantly you're like, I'm not in React land. This is actually still really bad because I haven't added cleanup logic yet. Let's do that before my browser dies. I actually once was demoing something like this, and it actually caused like the whole thing to go down, and then Code Sandbox went reload for like 5 minutes.
Riverside is thrashing with the heap on this.
Was a clear interval T. Okay. Yay, okay. So we fixed it, right? So not a big deal. So you think there's actually a problem here, because if there was some other state in this component that updated, it could update at different times and reset the interval when you not intended. You actually only want to set this interval once, so we should put a dependency array. I don't know if you guys have noticed, there hasn't been any dependency arrays yet because Solid doesn't.
I was going to bring that up. One of the things you've made simpler is that there was no dependency arrays because all your data fetching is through a function instead of the actual variable.
So, but this,
sorry, keep going.
This has a little bit of a problem. And the funniest thing is I already pre-optimized this one without noticing, but this version has this problem. Because count never updates past 1 because of stale closure. This is a little bit head wrapping, but essentially this function here switches over the original version of count, and it will never update. So the one solution is the one that I had here a second ago, where you use the function form, but the function form doesn't help you if you have like other props coming into your component, and so you can't actually do it that easily if you actually want it to be dynamic. And honestly, there's a couple more things, but Dan Abramoff, one of the React core maintainers, actually wrote the proper way of doing this, and I can show it to you here. Here's our counter. This one has none of the downsides that I was talking about, works perfectly with React. And yeah, okay. So I don't know if I can try and explain how this works, but essentially we use ref to keep a reference to the previous version of the callback so that it closes over that current version of state, so that when set interval calls it, it can grab the latest version. And then that way it's always the latest version, and we only set the interval once. And by using 2 use effects and a use ref, we have solved our problem.
Yeah, this is clearly where it starts to break down. I've done things like this kind of in corner cases, and yeah, you don't feel good about it.
The second you need to use ref for not a DOM interaction, like not to get the ref from the DOM, you know you've got in there, because then you're something like you're like, is this state or is this a ref? Because you're like, okay, do I want it to update or do I not want it to update? And when it's re-rendering, what state is the rest of the closures in at the time? And this whole category of problem didn't exist in those old reactive libraries, right? Because we're back.
Yeah, I just want to highlight this is what basically the function's 5 lines of code in the body of it, and let's just compare what the other one was. Something like 20.
Yeah.
The cognitive overhead of this.
Well, and there's an additional cognitive overhead. Like, you've got 2 use effects, right? And when you first glance, what you have to process is that, like, that use effect on line 11 is actually running every time. It has no dependency array, just so that you get the updated callback. And then the one on 15 only runs once.
Yeah.
And so you've got some effects that run all the time and some effects that run once. And the mental model, this is what makes the hook, mental model get a little difficult if you're not used to this. So I certainly can imagine how this is, like, at least in this example, definitely more clean.
This is like a lead React engineer interview question. It's not even like a senior React interview question.
Yeah. So, I mean, and what I was getting there is, with the solid example, we get to go back to the first thing you tried to write. To be fair, this is not the best component because there is one problem with this one. Even though this works fine and you'll never crash my browser, truthfully, it's good to clean up after yourself because, you might unmount this component if this wasn't the top level component like this. So we do have an on cleanup. Our effects don't return the function. I left them returning the value so they can be reducing. So we just have these manual calls to on cleanup. But essentially, just for illustrative purposes.
No, that's a really important call out. I was going to ask how you handle that.
But yeah, and we have an on mount, which is actually just a create effect with no dependencies. There's a couple nicety easy things I added for that kind of specific case, but generally speaking, like the reactive model, like if you've ever tried to write this in Svelte or Vue, it's also the same as Solid. It's like this. You're not in this use ref kind of like zone, and this is just a kind of function of reactivity. For me, that's where the simplicity comes from. It's not from typing a few less characters. I like the explicitity of React. This is why we've kind of differed here, because I like that count is not set count. I like that when you pass the props down, you can choose to pass the count or choose to set the set count. You're not just like letting things be mutated all over the tree and triggering. I mean, that's one of the places where Knockout fell down. Like it was just unbatched. That was one problem. MobX did solve that. And that mutations were like, you could have the butterfly effect, right? No one knew what was going on in their state management. Especially with nested proxies, you accidentally assign some piece of state somewhere down from a prop and someone's like locally assigning it because they're just doing some work here and they don't realize that they just like updated the value in the store and re-rendered half the app. React strict patterns solve that, and that's what I've adopted for Solid.
Interesting. I want to go back to that interval example. So that article that you mentioned that Dan wrote.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The conclusion of that article is that the reason this happens is because I'm trying to do the React defense here. React is great. It creates a very clean, declarative world. And what the root source of the problem here is hooks break down whenever you run into either something that violates that world. You've got something imperative or no longer maps to the declarative way of doing things. And that's when this happens. And what you need to do is take those non-declarative things and encapsulate them and wrap them into something that maps to that world. And if you do that with all the things intruding into your world, you can get back to a pure declarative functional world. And if I recall correctly, that's essentially the crux of this is this the...
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think he later on in this, if you scroll down, there's something about essentially this. I might not be phrasing it exactly correct. Are you saying that, how do you take that interpretation of the root cause of the problem, and especially through the lens of Solid? Do you agree with that, or do you disagree with that? Or do you say, when you're dealing with reactivity, you don't have to worry as much about that?
Yeah, I mean, how should I put it? I think the premise is correct. I think that the problem, especially in React's cases, you have a pure render function, and now suddenly you're introducing some imperative impure thing, and that's what useEffects for. But once you have useEffects talking to other useEffects, you're creating this kind of messy complexity, and it's kind of invaded. So try your best to encapsulate and keep React pure. And I think in general, this is the right thinking. The key difference here with reactivity, or at least fine grained, because a lot of libraries are reactive, Svelte or Vue are reactive. Solid's one of the only ones that I'm aware of in modern frameworks that actually is granular right down to the renderer. Like it's actually just doing the one little update without any kind of like pure reactivity. Is that if it depends on what that unit of change is. For React and the frameworks I just mentioned, the component is that unit of change. And because the component's the unit of change, that's the thing that you don't want to get messy, because you're like, this whole component is a pure thing, a pure transformation, and we don't want to mix imperative. But for Solid, if you view everything as like a side effect, the only stuff that needs to be pure is the computations, like the use memo, the expressions inside of it. So it's kind of funny because but we believe the same things. I've just tweaked the granularity. Like that's essentially the thing where instead of the components being the important part, we kind of gotten away from that. Components are nothing in Salt. They're like a function call. They don't own state. I didn't really show you guys that much, but like there is a create component call in the compiled output, but we might as well be just calling a function. Like all this reactivity guides the whole way Solid works, and it's all nested reactivity. You can view the whole tree as create effect inside create effect inside create effect. And this is kind of crazy and kind of completely different, but it allows us to think of things a lot in the same kind of sense. Because here's the thing, hooks themselves, the existence of actually creating something in the render function is kind of like a side effect. Like at least this is why this is harder, because when you run React over and over again, they don't recreate the hooks. They kind of pull it out of space, like some place that they've done it before. But conceptually, when you look at it, like it should be remaking these things over and over again. And if the reason that our model here is kind of simpler is because we're just acknowledging that like these are things that need to be created. So that whole creation is a side effect. And it's kind of like these little. It doesn't mean that we can't have purity. We have like create memo and calculations that are on the pure side, and then we have the create effect and the rendering that's on the rendering side. It's just more granular. But on the positive, I mean, it's kind of weird. It's why I'm able to emulate a lot of the stuff with Solid that React does. People talking about things like concurrent mode rendering and like you need a virtual DOM for that. No, you don't. Like because you can still separate the side effects from the pure calculations, and that because we're granular. React has fiber to do that. We have hooks. There are primitives. Like essentially, we just in order for React's future, they've made the internals of the compiler, or not the compiler, sorry, the runtime into more granular fibers. That's the term React fiber. You have all these granular fibers. Whereas Solid, the fibers are on the outside. So we essentially can achieve a lot of the same kind of things simply from the fact that we are granular. It's just a different model.
If I was to rephrase that, the summary I think for the audience would be, everything runs once to set up the DOM. And then when you're saying granular, the only thing that effectively is left that ever gets run is updates directly into the DOM. And there's no VDOM at all there. And that's essentially, and then you can parse out those micro updates. Now, that's what you're saying by granularity, just so that I'm...
Yeah, okay. Because each individual signal and individual effect has the potential of running independently. So you don't have to run effects that don't depend on that data just because they're in the same component. The component doesn't actually matter, and that's the simpler version of it.
So you mentioned concurrent mode, which is kind of a future state for React. Maybe it always will be. So talk about a little bit the future of Solid. Like one question I have is there any kind of support for SSR in Solid, and is there a plan or a community that's like building a framework for Solid, like a Next.js or a Svelte kit or a Nuxt for Solid?
Yeah. Those are great questions, and that was why Solid 1.0 took such a long time to come out. I'd already kind of pieced together the reactive system, like the core part of this, the client side part. Solid's been at the front of those like benchmarks, like the JS framework benchmark, since 2017 or something, or 2018, early 2018 maybe. Like we already had this approach, and I remember telling people at one point, I'm like, oh yeah, we're very close to 1.0, and then I was like, a realization came over to me that, oh, we actually have to talk about SSR. I'd given it no thought. So really, that's what I've been doing for the last 2.5 years. It's almost been solely working on SSR. So, I mean, and some of the concurrent transition stuff, but it's some of it's related, mostly. So, Solid has a pretty good SSR, and I mean, I can show you benchmarks, but it doesn't yeah, why not? People are aware that Solid, on the the JS framework benchmark, probably seen this before. On the client side, Solid's up here. See vanilla, Solid, best friends. Then you get down, you get Inferno and Svelte. But you know the story. Vue just made a huge jump, by the way, really awesome. But eventually, Preact, you kind of make your way down, and then you find React. And that's an Angular, and that's kind of the client side. But what people don't know about Solid as much is that on server-side rendering, and this is a test that was made by Marco originally, Solid's performance is equal, or it's probably more impressive. This is just raw rendering, but to give you an idea, I've been working on this and optimizing it a lot, and actually part of this came from the community trying to help us. But essentially, if you can read this text at all, this is just a simple search results, very similar to eBay's search results. That's what they based it on, the Marco team. And Marco's always very much dominated this area, 8,000, almost 10 times faster than React or Preact on rendering. And the reason for that is we just compile the strings. We don't bother with a VDOM on the server. I kind of borrowed that approach and then optimized it more to get to a whole nother level of performance. And here's another one for a simple color picker. This one is a smaller app with less static stuff, so you see Preact and React, better, but still Marco significantly, and Inferno specifically ahead. But then again, there's a lot of performance optimization coming to server rendering, and that's where basically doing less is more. And I was able to leverage the compiler and actually remove reactivity from the server to actually basically give you something very similar to Pug or like a static string renderer to get that kind of performance. So performance was definitely on my radar, but the problem is, after showing you all this, I'm going to basically say that this doesn't matter, because what really matters for server performance is the ability to coordinate that communication from the client and the server. As fast as the raw rendering is, we need to actually consider how that communication works. So what I've been working on for quite a while is the ability to use suspense on the server and fragments and streaming. So essentially, you can stream the page in, and then essentially show the placeholders. And at the same time that you're streaming to the client your response with the placeholders, you're fetching the data. And then as the data finishes, it comes back over the stream and fills in those placeholders. And I've done a lot of benchmarking and look, and this is Marco's approach, what they've been doing forever since since 2014. I learned a lot working with them, and this is coming in React 18 as well. Is this ability to just kind of bring the content in and start those fetches right away? It's incredible, because if you wait for the server to render your async data, you actually have to you wait for a lot of resources and stuff to start loading, and it's actually slower overall. You see some people go client-side rendering is faster than server-side rendering. With the right approach to client-side rendering, this was true, more or less. Streaming is really the way to get best of both worlds. You don't have to wait for those requests to start going. You get the assets loading in the client as soon as possible, and it just works. And this is why it's such a big deal for React, and I think it's going to be a big deal for every framework. This is what I was working on with Solid for a while. So I still have some more work to do, documentation, but we have implemented it into our starter, which is getting to where it's getting to. We've been also working on a Svelte kit type competitor called Solid Start. It is still an alpha, but we've written adapters for Cloudflare and Node and static adapter, and it's very basic, but it was enough that I was able to get like a simple Hacker News demo working on it, and not too much special here, but essentially this example has all the pieces. It has suspense, it has server-side suspense and streaming, all from a Cloudflare worker. But yeah, this is where things are heading. There's lots of work to be done in terms of like polish and pieces, but server-side rendering is tricky. There's different types of versions. There's streaming, there's static, there's SSG, there's SSR, there's all these things. So I do agree with Svelte's approach with SvelteKit of having an official solution, and that's something that we've been working on with the core team for Solid. But yeah, it's still going to take a little bit to get there, as SvelteKit has taken a little bit to get out as well. But yeah, I definitely feel it, because every time someone comes on, they're like, "Where's Next.js?" And I'm like, soon. And that's the biggest thing with us, right? 1.0 happened in July, so people are jumping on writing libraries. Someone working on a headless UI, and a lot of people really eager, on the bleeding edge of things, I'd say, because like, for example, there was a recent meme going around on Twitter about Svelte versus React and showing like how much less code React was and how it was an embarrassment. Someone basically went and wrote a pre-compiler for Solid that lets you write it like Svelte and then gets Solid. I don't know. I obviously designed Solid in a way where I had certain philosophical beliefs, but it's cool that people are experimenting and trying different kind of approaches to these things. So this is just kind of the start for us. So I'm hoping over the next few months we're going to see a lot more the fruit of that labor. As I said, a lot of people working on component libraries, they just haven't been published yet. And the Discord, that's where you come and check us out, is definitely very alive right now with a lot of different ideas and stuff floating.
What is, maybe that's a good seg for, what are your long-term goals with Solid? We've got Vue and React and a handful of others that rule the ecosystem and seem to have an insurmountable lead. What's your goal as a challenger framework? And then flipping that around, when should a developer team bet on Solid for the next project and versus those other ones?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, right? I get asked that a lot more now. It's funny because I didn't start Solid for like adoption or trying to get people on it. I was just trying to build something for my startup, which we ended up not even using. So honestly, to a certain degree, you could hope that some of these optimizations just make into other frameworks. Like people see what we did, and it is, especially Svelte. The team there is very conscious of the performance and stuff. So a lot of the stuff I've commented on issues. I've made issues on Svelte. It looks like they're in the direction to improve on some of their stuff, given some of my findings of the work I did with Solid. But Solid also, even though it's kind of evolutionary rather than revolutionary, we're not trying to change how people do things in the same way. Like we're not like saying use a different dialect of JavaScript or like just write your JavaScript code. It employs ideas that just aren't present and not easily present in other frameworks, like this kind of idea of componentless, essentially, because it goes beyond components just running once. We essentially remove all the overhead of components, which means that they're not a consideration for performance boundaries. This isn't true of any library that update cycles based on components. So I don't see other frameworks changing to be that way. So from that space, at least what we're doing is unique. So it's hard to say if people will, adopt or will actually, think what looks on the surface as a bunch of incremental improvements in a whole number of areas will be enough. But, as I said, I'm going to just keep on pushing the boundary. I love this stuff. I love performance. I love looking at development patterns. And I say I work on two frameworks. It's not terribly surprising. So myself and we have a core team now of about 6 people working on Solid. Like we're just going to keep on pushing it and growing the community. And if people sign on, that's cool. If not, it is what it is. But at least where we're sitting, we're working on a fairly unique solution.
So I have one question I'm interested in is the streaming part you're talking about before. Yeah. How does that, what protocol do you use there? Are you just are you doing like WebSockets or how does that work?
Yeah. It's actually it's just HTTP 1.1 chunked encoding. It's been in the web since 1997. This is hilarious. Like, to me, it's just funny because
I think Google Docs actually used to use that under the hood too.
Yeah.
And
it's an old technique. And the truth of the matter is, at some point, we stopped doing it as much. And I don't know, I remember someone was commenting that like .NET in 2005 didn't support streaming, and that was terrible because the pages loaded slow and all this. But big companies have been looking at this for a long time and using this kind of technique, like BigPipe at Facebook for their PHP service that used streaming, and that was the technique that they used there, and that was a huge influence. That's where Suspense came from. Even though they introduced it to us as like this client-side rendering thing, they were trying to figure out how do we set boundaries to stream those placeholder sections into the page. And as I said, Marco, back in 2014, that was one of their design goals. They're like, we're going to make BigPipe essentially in JavaScript. And as I said, next year React will have BigPipe in JavaScript as well. So this is old, and it was funny because as I said, that article from 2005 that was talking about it called "Streaming a Lost Art." That was in 2005, and it just keeps on coming around again,
And so, just for the audience, basically, it's a connection, and you just never close the initial connection.
Well,
right?
you close it at the end when you say like, "Hey, I'm done." But you can run pretty long running. Like, you just open the connection, you start streaming out your main page, and then you can just keep on streaming stuff. And the trick here is we use script tags to insert those placeholders. Like, Marco also has an in-order streaming mode, which is kind of even crazier, where they actually can block and just flush stuff out as it's ready. And in that case, you don't need any JavaScript in the browser. But generally speaking, even the out of order is kind of great because it comes in through that initial page and you're just rendering in that HTML, and just script tag inserting it. You don't need the framework runtime to be there at the time that the streaming happens. So you get the loading states and you get the chunks loading in and the data requesting on the server. So there's just so much JavaScript code you don't need to send to the browser in those scenarios, especially in frameworks like Marco, which support partial hydration. But yeah,
that's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I remember doing that kind of chunk encoding like more than a decade ago in Java to just make things stream onto a page, and it's back again. That's awesome.
Yeah, and as I said, this is not just like a few outliers going like, oh, this is really cool, and even like specific use case like e-commerce and Marco. This is coming to React 18, right? Like, this is mainstream as far as mainstream goes. So it's going to be interesting to see if the platforms change to support it. This has been one of the classic problems we've had with streaming, is that a lot of the platforms don't support it. Like, obviously you can get a node backend and you can do it, but a lot of serverless worker environments don't support it.
Lambda doesn't support it. Yes, that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, AWS I don't think supports it right now either. Like, Cloudflare, that was what initially got my attention with Cloudflare, and why I made this demo here on Cloudflare, because they were one of the easiest ones I could just show like a full serverless at the edge. And the thing is, streaming at the edge is really beneficial in my opinion. I mean, it depends on stuff, but you think about it. Streaming is best when you basically can get the client as close, get the close to your client as possible, but the database is further, because you get the page almost instantly. Like, let's say you're on edge rendering, you get the page to the client almost as fast as a CDN, like immediately for the synchronous stuff. And then if the data takes longer, it's just loading. You know what I mean? Like, so basically, the closer you get your page serving to the end user, and maybe the database now has a slightly more latency, the better streaming is. So I think maybe that's part of the comeback. I think serverless actually makes streaming even better. Obviously, there's distributed databases, and that's a whole other thing. But if your database is right next to your renderer, you won't see as much benefit from streaming, perhaps, if there's no latency. But not all systems are like that. And I said, as we move closer to the edge, I think it's a key technology.
So what are some of the things that developers should look forward to in the near-term kind of roadmap for Solid.js? Okay,
yeah. So obviously Solid Start is really important, our Svelte competitor. I think people should look at that. I think that's actually really probably one of the bigger pieces coming in. The other things that are coming up in the near future are just more nicety around server-side rendering. our server-side rendering on Solid right now isn't completely where I want it to be. Mostly that we're streaming data and we're still using hydration to do the out of order placement. It still requires the runtime to do the inserts essentially. Whereas in the future, I want it to work like I just mentioned, that it works in Marco, where you can basically put that content in without the runtime being loaded. Things like that. The truth of the matter is, since we've hit most parity with React-like features, I'm actually hoping that it's actually the ecosystem and the stuff around Solid that gets people excited. For myself and the core team, other than Solid Start, it's just a lot of refinement. Solid is already very feature rich. It has context and suspense on the server, async render. Like, it has a lot of the key checkbox, portals, like fragments. There's a lot of features, current rendering even, like that are already in there. So this is just going to be a time for us to kind of really solidify those foundations and make it easier for developers to get started with Solid.
Yeah, and then, to wrap it up, if people want to learn more and participate in the Solid.js ecosystem, where should they go to learn more or hear more from you about Solid?
Yeah, I mean, Discord is the thing. They can follow me on Twitter or Solid.js on Twitter, Ryan Carniato or Solid_JS on Twitter. But Discord is where all the conversation's happening. The Solid.js Discord is, as I said, quite alive these days, and I think you should come if you want to see if the libraries exist, want to try and write in the library, want to get involved. Just join our Discord. The links are off the website. The website is great too. It's pretty new. It came out with 1.0, and we have lots of docs and the whole simple short form tutorial thing. There's 40 tutorials here. You can just get started with all the concepts. Admittedly, probably more familiar in certain ways to React developers. We're working on making the docs a little bit easier for everyone. It's just I have a bit of React blinders myself. I've just been using JSX and stuff so long, but this is still a really good place to get started.
Very cool. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for coming on and schooling us on Solid. It looks really exciting. Really excited to see what happens.
That's awesome. I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on JavaScript Jam.